My name is Thuy Dinh, and I came to the United States at 13. We left on, the day that we left Vietnam was April 21st, 1975, and we spent 3 days in Clark Air Base in the Philippines. And then we went to Guam. We spent there a week, and that was when we found out that Saigon fell. Saigon fell on April 30th. So we were in Guam for about a week, 10 days, when we heard that Saigon fell. And then from there, we were processed to go to California. So we stayed a month in Camp Pendleton. And people, there was no set time. People could stay there a few weeks or a whole month, or months, even years, because it depends on whether they would have a sponsor to sponsor their family. So if you don't have a sponsor that could sponsor your family, you could just stay there. And sometimes people, it really depended on the individual family or the person, if they were impatient. For example, I think the reason why there is currently a large population of Vietnamese settling in Orange County and other parts of California was because the climate is warm. And so when people were in the camp, they said, we like this climate. We'll just leave when we find the person who would sponsor us. And sometimes they've already had relatives or family living in the area, so their family members could just sponsor them. So the people who decided to settle in California could just stay as little as just a few weeks. And then they found someone to sponsor them, and they would leave the camp. We had 10 people in my family. My grandfather was a translator for the U.S. government. He worked in the Defense Attaché Office of the Department of Army, U.S. Army, and he started working in the late 50s when the Americans, that was before the that was when Americans were hired as advisors. They came to Vietnam as early as the late 50s. And they set up an air base in Bien Hoa, which was about, I would say, almost an hour outside of Saigon. And they were in need of Vietnamese translators. And my grandfather happened to know English. At the time, there were a lot of Vietnamese, and many people knew French, but very few knew English. So he was one of the few that learned English, and so he was hired as an interpreter, as a translator. And so in 1975, he had been working for the Americans for 20 years. So he knew that South Vietnam probably would not last. He knew it before any of us did. And so he started preparing for our exit out of Saigon. And he was our grandfather, so technically he was not he was not my father. He was not an immediate family member, but he had enough pull that he managed to get. My mother is his daughter, his second daughter. He has 2 daughters, and my aunt, my mother's older sister, she was already in Australia at the time because her husband was a diplomat working for the South Vietnamese embassy. So they were in actually Canberra in Australia. So she was already abroad, but my mom's family was the only family that my grandparents had. And my grandfather really wanted us to get out because we were all young. I was the oldest one and I was 13. And so my youngest brother was only 6 months old. So he knew that with him as someone who had worked for the Americans for 20 years, and if the communists came in, we being his grandchildren and my parents being associated with him probably would have a very hard life, because people who were affiliated with the South Vietnamese, there was a fear that they would be blacklisted. And that fear, came out to be to be true. And in April 1975, he was anticipating all of that. So he did everything he could to get us out. And I think his process, the process of preparing our escape, actually took months before that. But I was young and he did not tell us anything, because the less you tell the younger people, or the less you convey any of the information, would be safer, you know, for you and for them. So anyway, so he, my dad at the time was not with us. He was actually imprisoned by the South Vietnamese government because he was a columnist and he was a dissident. And so he was jailed. So we didn't know where, you know, what happened, anything. We had lost information. We had lost information about him. We knew that he had been transferred to like a secluded cell. And the last time that we saw him was like Lunar New Year, February of 1975. That was the last time that we saw him. For months before that, actually for years starting in the early 70s, he wasn't at home with us because of his role as a dissident, a government, against the government. He was a columnist. So he went underground, but he had ways to send his work to be published in the papers, but he was always faster than the government. So, you know, for a while he was able to elude them, but eventually he was caught. And once he was caught, at first we sort of knew where he was, and I was able to come and visit him in prison. But after February of 1975, we lost all contacts with him. We didn't know where he was. We just knew because my mom had a cousin who was a lawyer. So he was able to get information for her, and he told her that he had been taken to a secluded place because there was a lot of paranoia and fear, and the South Vietnamese government toward the end, you know, the president was really paranoid about, he was afraid, but until the end, he was afraid that he would be toppled, that there would be a coup, which was kind of ridiculous because instead of like worrying about how, you know, all the major cities in Saigon would start falling, instead of worrying about that and his men were being massacred, you know, he was worried more about his own standing. So the reason why I think my dad was caught because he feared that there was a coup that was brewing in my dad. He feared that my dad was part of it. But anyway, you know, we left in April 75 due to my grandfather. He was able to do all this preparation. That's how we were able to leave. And so we spent time in the Philippines. Basically, every of our stop along the way was because of the U.S., you know, having a military presence. You know, in the Philippines, they had Clark's Air Base. It had been closed, I think, for probably almost 20 years now, but at the time, there was a functioning base in Manila, Philippines, and we went there for 3 days, just enough to get settled and to kind of get our paperwork processed. And then we moved to the next station, which was Guam. And then from there, we went to Camp Pendleton. And because we were the first wave of refugees that left, things were actually, you know, it wasn't that hard. I mean, and I was young, so I was kind of excited. It was like a trip. So we went to Camp Pendleton and we stayed there for about a month. And my grandfather, we were all Catholic, so my grandfather said that, well, because there were so many of us there, my grandfather, my grandmother, and my mom, and there were 6 of us. The youngest was 6 months old, and I'm the oldest, so I was 13. So there are 9 of us, right? Yeah, 7 in my family, and then my grandparents were 9. So he said that we would be better off if we would be sponsored by a church as opposed to an individual, because by then, even though we, a month in camp was not that long of a time. But we've heard, because there were people who were impatient, like they came to the camp, and then when they got the offer, like from sponsorship, they left. But then some of them came back because there were horror stories. They would go to like South Carolina, North Carolina, anywhere in the South, or these like rural areas. And they were basically, even though they were sponsored, they became like indentured, served, like almost like slaves. They would be working on farms and they would not be paid. So they felt like they were kind of like being enslaved. So they found ways back to the camps, and they would tell all the refugees, they said, you guys should just like stay put and wait until you have properly vetted the sponsors and where you want to go, because you really don't want to end up in some rural area that's cold. Because most Vietnamese at the time, the main concern was the weather. You don't want to go to like some extreme place with extreme weather or in a rural area, because the first wave of refugees, we came from the urban area. So most people liked being in the city. So if you get stranded in a rural area, it's just not you're just not used to anything like that. So the main thing is to go to someplace warm and where it's relatively urban or not like so rural. So people came back, they said, you should just really take the time to investigate where you're going, and then also investigate the background of the sponsor and not just jump at the first chance you got. So after my grandfather hearing these stories, he said, okay, so we should go with a church, a Catholic church, because a Catholic church would have all the resources everybody could help us, because it was just not one person. The church would have several people, and we were also Catholic, so that would be easier, because we also heard stories about people who were Buddhists or came from other religions and got sponsored by Christian sponsors, and they were forced to become Christians, and that would be also a problem. But we would not have that problem because we were Catholics to begin with. So what he did, it was a wise choice. So we were sponsored by a Catholic church in Alexandria, Virginia, Blessed Sacrament Church, and that's how we came and settled in Alexandria, Virginia. So that was our first, that's how we left the camp and we came here. And I've stayed here ever since 1975. We lived in Alexandria for the first almost 3 years. We came in the end of May, Memorial Day, 1975. May 29 was our first. We settled. We arrived here May 29. The reason why I know the date, because there was actually an article in the Washington Post about arrival. We were the first family that was sponsored by the Catholic diocese in this area. So my mom and my brother actually were photographed on the metro section, and there was a date, so we remember the date. It was May 29. So we spent 3 years in Alexandria, and the church was really nice. They had many people, and each member basically was tasked with helping us, like one aspect. They basically did like a triaging, one person would take us to register us for school, and one person would take us to doctor's appointments, and one would take us to cultural events, like at the Kennedy Center. Like I was saying, like we were so lucky in that sense because we were the first wave. So people did not have any preparation, didn't know what to expect. So, and we were, I was 13, but all my siblings were like pretty young. But then one of our church members took us to the Kennedy Center to listen to classical music. Of course, we fell asleep. It's just like, it's not something that you would, to take like the little kids to. But we were, we got like all these very nice kind of like gestures. And so we have different church members coming and taking care of us, and then we'd have someone who would take us to the grocery store. So at the time, they didn't have Eden Center yet. So they had like Clarendon, on Wilson Boulevard. It used to be the Little Saigon. So we would go there to shop for food. And because we had no idea of like where everything was, so we were in Alexandria. So if you were just to drive from Alexandria to Clarendon, Wilson Boulevard, it probably would take you at most 12 minutes, but we thought it was a really long trip. So we didn't want to like bother the church members. So we really wanted like fish sauce and all the Asian food, but we would like being really frugal. It was like, okay, we should not use the fish sauce too much. We should use like sea salt. You know, you don't ask to go to the grocery store until you really needed it. So we would like wait until we're like totally, you know, really desperate before we ask them to go and get our grocery from Wilson Boulevard. So yeah, so at first we stayed at the schoolhouse. The church, Blessed Sacrament, has like a Sunday school, an area where the kids would go to Sunday school. And they did not have time to find us housing. So when we came in the end of May, we stayed there throughout the summer, and we went to ESL school. The kids went to ESL school, got kind of acclimated. And my grandfather, and actually my dad, he eventually got out too. He left Vietnam on like basically the last ship out of Vietnam. The president left. He went to Hong Kong, and then he went to London. The only country that wanted to take him in was England. So he took the ship out, and he was sponsored by, he went to England. And then the vice president became president, and he used to be a dissident in the past. So as soon as he became president, he decided to release all the political prisoners. So my dad got released on the 28th, and the 30th was the fall of Saigon. So he had 2 days, and he managed to get out just in time. He got on a Navy ship, a US Navy ship, and that's how he got out. And so we were able to reconnect with him because the link between my father and all of us was through my aunt in Australia. So when he was in the ship, he remembered he had her address. So he wrote to her. And so the mail reached my aunt. And so my aunt wrote to us in the camp because she also knew that we had gone out. So that's how we knew that my dad was able to get out. So we were really happy. We were in Camp Pendleton when we got the news. And my grandfather was all the stress. He actually was sick. So he was kind of being sequestered in a separate area. And when he heard the news, he was so happy that he recovered. So we came to Virginia in the end of May. So it's about 2 weeks later that my dad came and joined us. He was shipped to another camp, Indianatown Gap in Pennsylvania. And some of our church members worked in the military. So he got like some strings. So he was able to get my dad to take the bus to go to Alexandria and meet us. So he didn't have to spend all that time at the camp, because basically he was being sponsored, by the same church. So he was able to get out. So we joined him. And as soon as they let my, I think like a week after he arrived to Alexandria, he said he wanted to find a job. We were on food stamp because all of us, was $300. My grandfather converted his last salary that he received from the U.S. government before we got out. And because at the time the situation was so, inflation was horrendous, when he converted the currency, because he got paid in local money, the piastre, when he converted, it was like $300. That was his entire life saving, $300. So all we had was $300 when we came to the U.S. So we were qualified for food stamp. But with the first wave, because the first wave of refugees, Vietnamese refugees, we were from the urban area, and most of the people in the first wave were fairly well educated. So there was a sense of shame that you would be on, welfare. So my grandfather and my dad decided that as soon that they came here, they would find whatever job they could take, they would work right away. Because the sooner they would get off a food stamp, the better. Because there's a sense of pride. They did not want to feel like, they did not want to be burdened. So there is a sense of that because we had more, we were refugees, but I think that we did have more resources than the latter waves because of our education and because of a sense also pride, and that and my grandfather also knew English. He was fluent. He was our translator, and so he could get information. So because of all these resources, we also felt that we should not, which is, a sense of shame that you don't want to be a burden. So anyway, within about 2 weeks after my dad got here, he got a job parking cars at Colonial Parking, right next to the Museum of Air and Space Museum. So that was his first job. And my grandfather also worked there, but he worked as a cashier. You know, he would station himself at the booth with people coming in and out of the garage. But my dad, he was a parking attendant. And at the time, people, our sponsors, you know, they were very nice, but they had no idea about, most of them don't know where Vietnam was. They had no idea who we were. So they thought Vietnam, most people lived in the jungle. So when we came here, they told us how to make ice and, you know, how to run the fridge, you know, and they show us the TV, and they were like, wow, you know, you have to learn a lot because these are things that must be so overwhelming to you. And we said, no, we actually live in the city. We had all these things. And then my dad said, and I can drive a car. I just need to get my license. But in Vietnam, I have driven a car for 20 years. They could not believe it. It's like, really, you didn't like ride a bike? I said, no, I have a car. And they couldn't, like, was just floored. And so he went and got his driver's license, and he passed, and they was like, wow, we passed the first time. I said, of course, I've been driving. And so he actually enjoyed being a car attendant because he loved cars. He was obsessed with cars. Like every 2 or 3 years, he would have a new car in Vietnam. So being a car attendant, he could drive like all these fancy cars because it's like in the city. So he was a columnist. So he wrote for a Vietnamese newspaper about his experience working as a car attendant, and to him it was in heaven to drive like these fancy cars. And I think he exaggerated. He said one time I think he crashed a car in when he backed out, but he didn't tell the client. So I don't know whether it was real or not, but it was very funny. If you were a writer, like when you first got settled here, you would write about your stories, and then you have people who could read Vietnamese read your stories. I mean, of course, Americans, you know, these are like stories among ourselves. We tell ourselves these stories, but the mainstream public, the Americans, would not know these stories necessary. Again, there's a sense of pride too, you know, and you wanted to be, there's a sense also, you feel like you have to be gracious, you have to show gratitude to the Americans because they sponsored us, they got us out of Vietnam, but among ourselves, we were more honest, especially if you were writers, you would talk about your feelings in your articles. And my mom talked about a sense of shame among the Vietnamese community, especially if the people who used to be generals or professors, college professors, or any sort of like white collar jobs come here and have to be janitors or taking any jobs, you know, to survive, because they all have the sense of pride on the one hand of not wanting to be on the dole, but on the other hand, they felt ashamed that they have to take on these jobs. So no one wanted to talk about their, you know, menial jobs. So in my dad's article, which unfortunately he no longer has, but I remembered because I was still reading, you know, I could read Vietnamese. My level, when I left Vietnam, I had finished 7th grade. But I think that maybe I was more precocious because both my parents were teachers. So I read a lot of stuff that I was not supposed to read. So I read all of his articles. And I love that story that he wrote about the sense of shame among the Vietnamese community. How, you know, like he said he had a friend who was a lawyer, but now he had to work cleaning offices. But he would be, the friend would be very vague. It would say like, oh, I work in a law office. So people, because they felt ashamed, they would be very vague about where they work. They would not say that I'm a janitor, you know, I work in a funeral home. They would like make kind of bluffing. They'd say I worked in a law office. They didn't say that you worked as a cleaning person. Or like he had another friend who worked for a funeral home as a, you know, like cosmetician, you know, for the dead. He said, oh, I'm in, you know, the whatever, you know, I'm in the aesthetic industry, you know, some fancy words. But so people were just making up things, and then he wrote about that. So it's these articles by writers of that period were like diary entries, it kind of capture that period. But of course, you know, the mainstream would not know of these things that we wrote about for our community. So it's a sense of like, almost like if you were a writer back then, if you write, it would be like a sense of release. It's also kind of make you feel, yeah, it's almost like a group therapy kind of thing when you write, because everyone would understand where you're coming from. But it's also a sense of privacy, because you would write and publish in Vietnamese, and you know the American public would not know about these things. They just look at you and probably think that, oh, these people need help. You know, these are refugees. They are victims. Because we did not feel comfortable sharing with them how we felt. So they did not know of all of these complexities that we were experiencing necessarily. And so these experiences would be, you know, maybe get recorded later, you know, passing down through the generations, like through their sons or daughters, or through me hearing or reading these stories, but would not necessarily come from the first generation that came here, because they did not feel comfortable sharing that. And also there's a language barrier. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but language barrier, or just a sense of pride and shame at the same time. You know, like with first generation refugees, I am actually in the 1/2 generation, because I came over here with my parents, but I was younger. So I think we're classified as the 1/2 generation. With our generation, there was a pressure that you had to go to school and basically find some job that actually would feed you, you know, would pay money. You could not go into the arts, because that was just not practical at all. So my major in college was English. It was English and French literature. And I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know. I mean, there was this sense that it's almost like you can, you know, if you say like worthless, it's just too strong a word, but it's like I had no skills that could like sustain me. Meanwhile, you know, my brother and all my cousins, my male cousins, they were engineers or pre-med. So I went to law school. But even though I went to law school and became a lawyer, I've always wanted to work in the arts. And I think the similar story was with my husband. He came here at a different time, but he was also 13 years old, the exact same age that I was. But he came here in the mid-60s, and his field is in, I think, IT, but you know, in technical field. But he always liked film. So we met when we were both running the film festival, the Asian American Film Festival. He had been doing that for years, and he sort of wanted to have someone else take over. So we had a mutual friend. She was a poet in DC, and there was an organization, Asian American Art and Media, where it's like an umbrella. If you were like an artist or poet or writers, you would join the organization, and one of its activities is the film festival, and he had been running it, I think, for over a decade. And so our poet friend came to me one day, because she had heard me talking a lot about films, and she said, "You like films, right?" And I said, "Yeah, I love films." And then she said, "Well, do you want to run the film festival?" And I'm like, wow, that's like such a big thing, you know. And she said, "Don't worry, you know, I'll introduce you to Kai, and he will show you the ropes." And so she, you know, she took us, you know, and I met my husband, and he was just like, you know, it's very brief at first. She said, "Don't worry, you know, it seems like it's overwhelming." At the time, this is back in the early 90s, so we didn't have digital film. I mean, the work even now is very different, because it's like, if I don't know that one item, my mind, and like, I'm not settled. I need to know. And he was like, "But that's not relevant." I said, "It is relevant to me. I have to know." So anyway, but you know, I think that we, you know, because we have our interest in film, and we both are Vietnamese Americans, we had a lot of similarities, and so that's how we met, and we from there we decided we like each other, we like to spend time with each other, and that's how we got married. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I have trinkets, but I had written an article a few years ago about, you've heard of Marie Kondo, right?
Yeah,
about things that how do you clean up? And how she said that there are certain things you should not hold on to things, if they're just going to take up space and they're no longer relevant to you. But the article that I wrote talked about, but if you are a refugee, how do you make that decision? Especially if you are like the daughter or the son, and then you end up with the artifacts from your parents. They come over with certain things. And both of my parents are still alive, but in certain other cases, when they had parents or grandparents, I mean, my grandparents both, passed away about 20 years ago. We had to go over go through their stuff. And so the question was, what would we hold on, and what should we, let go? Because the things that were meaningful to them might not be meaningful to us if we don't know the history. But once if you know the history of why they brought certain things with them, then you would not want it to, right. throw them away. So the whole idea of like cleaning out, and get rid of things, it doesn't work when you have like in a refugee situation and you wanted to preserve the history. But the problem is if you don't have if the line of communication is not open between the older generation and the younger one, and you don't know the significance of these things, then you could just like throw out things that might be meaningful, but it would be too late afterward. Like my mother, she had these áo dài. You're familiar with the Vietnamese áo dài, right? It's the formal dress. It's like a mandarin color, and it has like 2 slits, but you wear pants with that. So she had these áo dài from Vietnam, and I love them because in photographs I could see them, but she got rid of them. So when I wrote that article, I said, I want to take pictures of those áo dài that you brought over from Vietnam. And she said, oh, I threw them out. And I said, why did you throw them out? And she actually was very upset. I guess maybe because of the way I asked the questions, almost like judgmental, like, didn't you know that these would be valuable? So she was kind of defensive. And she said, well, because they were no longer at the time, I didn't need them. She was working basically 2 jobs, just to help out, to help us survive. And also there were 6 of us. So she was like, why would I wear these áo dài? They were like ceremonial things, we don't need them. So she just basically gave them away. So there were things like that. It was, I think we did lose a few things because the process was just kind of chaotic. They both became sick at the same time. My grandmother was afflicted with Alzheimer, and my grandfather, because he had been smoking since he was 16, but he actually did not have lung cancer until he was like 83, but his decline was very swift. I mean, he died within 6 months of first being diagnosed with lung cancer. But they were sick at the same time, and and my grandfather passed away before my grandmother did. My grandmother died 6 months after he passed away. But the apartment where they were staying, when, after my grandfather passed away, and we knew that my grandmother would not return to the same place because now she had Alzheimer and it was getting worse. So we put her in a nursing home, and we knew that she would not come back. We had to evacuate because it's like a government subsidized apartment. So there was a waiting list. So we had to leave the space so that other family could move in. So when we went and cleaned out his apartment, we just had their apartment. We had one weekend, and we had like the whole family came by to clean. But it was kind of chaotic because we were also working like pressured for time. So we did end up, I think we kept as much as we could, but we lost. He had a dictionary of Vietnamese terms translate to English because he worked with the intelligence section of the U.S. Army, so he knew all the slangs. He could overhear messages from the Viet Cong, and he would transcribe them in what are these words, they're slang or coded words in Vietnamese, and how it would translate into English. To me, that would be such a treasure, because he had to listen on these messages and transcribe them and pass them on because it's part of his intelligence work. And he had this whole dictionary that he hand wrote because these are things he learned on the job. And for whatever reason, we lost that notebook doing the cleaning out the apartment. But he did have kind of a will, and so he had a musical instrument. You heard of the đàn tranh, which is like a koto? He gave it to my cousin because she had always wanted to learn. And then I thought, it's kind of interesting because I felt it was unfair. Like he decided early on, like who was good with what things. And he always thought that she was better, like musically, more music inclined. So he never taught me how to play this instrument. And I was kind of resentful. I'm like, oh, so she got this, instrument and I didn't get it. But he gave me a rocking chair, and then he gave his, because he said that's a rocking chair he liked to sit on, and that's when he's most relaxed. And then he gave the screen, like a lacquer screen, to my other cousin. Actually, I wanted to correct that koto, that đàn tranh, my youngest sister ended up having it. But I was just confused because when my cousin was younger, he taught her how to play it. But my youngest sister actually ended up with the musical instrument, with his. It had a crack because when he took the musical instrument, he insists it's very long. It's like 6 feet long. And when we left Vietnam, we were supposed to only carry like 2 bags of like very compact things. Like he said, we were instructed to bring like 2 sets of clothes. Nothing extraneous. And then he had this long đàn tranh thing, but he was the head of the family, so I guess he had, he could do whatever he wanted. So when it came here, because of change in the climate, it had a crack. So he didn't play it. He actually got another instrument. So that was just for show. So for years, he would hang it on his wall. And I think because maybe my cousin was supposed to get it, but because the cleaning process, getting everything out of his apartment was so chaotic that everything goes, first come, first serve, you grab whatever you could. But he did have a letter, he said that this person should get that. And so whatever that he didn't specify, you just get. I also ended up with all of his paperwork. To me, that's also precious because his resume, his employment history from when he first started working with the U.S. Army, and his salary and his deed, the mortgage deed to his house. So I had all of these historical documents. Yeah, I thought that, the one thing, and it still mystified me to this day, is the sleepover. I think that's an issue with a lot of refugee and immigrant parents. So we first came here, and I think the church wanted us to get to know, like, especially with the younger kids, to know like children of other church members. So they suggested that we would come to their homes for sleepovers, but that used to really stress me out. I'm like, I don't know these people. Why do I want to stay over overnight too? And so my, the sponsor would say, we would love to have like Thuy over for a sleepover with Laura at Lori's house, and because she can hang out with Lori. So I'm like, I don't know Lori, that's like, I don't want to go, blah, blah, blah. And so my grandfather was put in an awkward situation. I mean, he understood where I was coming from, but he also understood that we would be seen as antisocial if we say, no, we don't want to come. So there was like no option to say, well, you couldn't say, oh, she didn't feel comfortable. She didn't feel like she knew Lori enough to come over, because it wasn't just like a sleepover, which is one girl. We were supposed to have a sleepover with Lori and all her friends. And so I knew that like, I would just like stick out, because she already knew all these, her other friend who had gone with her through school, probably from way back. And here I came in, and and also Lori actually was not my age. I mean, like we were pretty small, so we were actually older than most of the kids. Lori was actually two grades below me. She was a 6th grader, and I had finished 7th grade. So technically I should be with people that are going on the 8th grade. But since there were no 8th graders around, she said, we just hang out with Lori. I'm like, well, So it was very awkward. So I used to dread those like sleepovers. And I noticed that is not like something that is just like unique. I think most refugees and immigrants are kind of, like it's kind of stressed out, because it's kind of an intimate environment. And if you're weird, you don't want it to seem weird, because your habits or how you interact within your own home may be different from like when you are in an American home, and you don't know like what Americans behave in their private space. So that was very stressful. And also I didn't know what I had no idea like what kind of food they would eat. Like we didn't, to us, like when I first came here, like I thought it was weird that Americans ate like different things for breakfast, and then for lunch and dinner. To us, we just ate the same thing. I mean, you could eat pho for breakfast or lunch or dinner. You're like, why would you have to eat like cereal, for breakfast, and then or bagel or whatever, and then you eat other things? So I was stressed out, like even like the morning after, and I didn't realize that you had to pour milk into your cereal. And I've never had a lot of the food. It's just kind of like jump in. So in some way, I guess it wasn't bad, because you had, the fully immersive approach. And you don't know, you had no way of, you don't have any preparation. But maybe like just to jump in like that, then you just learn. Because maybe if I was given too much, because my mother's approach, like now she thinks that we're really we're really indulging our kids. She would say that you guys really indulging your children. You give them too many choices, and that's always like the gripe of the older generation. Like you just you're spoiling. Like you should not have that many choices. You should just jump in, because when you jump in, then you will know what you're made of. But when you have too many choices, then it's just easy to say no. You take the path of, the least resistance. So I don't know. I just don't know. But the sleepover was really stressful for me. And I guess, there is, and that's not just it, but it's also, like icebreakers too. Like later when I go to college, I always thought like the icebreakers are really weird. Like the game where you're supposed to like fall back and someone is supposed to catch you. I'm like, but I don't know these people. You're just kind of like being enforced to play this social role, but it's all enforced, and it's this enforced intimacy, and so there's a goal that built in. But I think from the Asian mindset, someone, but you don't have a built-in expectation. You just take all the time that you need to get to know someone. And maybe there is a purpose, but the purpose is not so explicit, so built in. But I think American culture, everything, it's built in, like even a social interaction, there is a built-in expectation that you're gonna get something out of it. Just like the icebreaker, you kind of have to know your, other college students, a meet and greet in any kind of a career situation, or even like a working lunch. I used to hate that, and I had to go to these working lunch as a lawyer. I'm like, why can I enjoy my food? I have to eat and pay attention to some boring guy talk about, So that is those things that I'm struggling with, that there's that built-in expectation in the social fabric in American culture that to me is not so explicit or so overt, in Vietnamese culture, that you have more time to cultivate the friendship or the relationship. I think the church was our major played a very major role because in addition of being our sponsors, we also went to church. So it was like the center of our social interaction, because Sunday we'd go to church and we go to that church. We went to CCD, which is like, catechism, also the same church. So for the first few years, it was the center of our lives. And it was also, because like in Vietnam, when you go to church, you would go like very, like you're supposed to, like very proper. But in the 70s, when you go to these church, they have a youth mass where they actually play rock music, and you could show up at church being barefooted. There was not like a dress code that you had to like dress up. You could like wear like shorts, because the whole idea in the 70s is that you have to be open and you want to attract young members. So you have to be a little more liberal in the way you make the church idea be attractive to young people. So I would see like people going to church barefooted, or wearing shorts with the kind of like, unhemmed shorts and unkempt hair, beards, and they play all the rock song, which I liked. Like Leader of the Pack was one of the songs that they play. So I at first I loved it, but we never liked church, because it's like my mom said, okay, you don't like church, but if you, again, it's like it's not an option. You have to do things so that you would have good habits going on. You just can't, like say you don't want to do something and you just don't want to do it. So we really resisted church, but the church, Blessed Sacrament Church, for a while, we actually enjoyed going to the youth, the rock group, the rock mass. But then, because it was church, after a while, it kind of got old too. So, so the first few years, that was the center of our lives. But then we also had, my parents had friends who were other refugees. As soon as they got settled, they had ways of connecting with their other friends through the mail or through different ways of, that was before social media. So you post like these news like on the magazine, Vietnamese magazine or Vietnamese newspaper. You say that I'm so-and-so, I'm now settled in Kansas City, and I know so-and-so, if you've gotten out, please reach out to me. I'm at this number. So people use the Vietnamese magazines and the newspapers to get in touch before the days of social media. So one of my parents' best friends, he ended up in Topeka, Kansas, as a librarian. So when he found out that my parents lived in Alexandria, he drove all the way from Topeka, to Alexandria, and he stayed with us for the first 3 years. And we had like a spare bedroom, so he stayed, and he, and then almost like every weekend, my parents would have parties with all these old friends from Vietnam that they reconnected with. But my dad's friend from Topeka was one of the friends that reconnected. And because he was a librarian, he brought with him a trunk full of books. They were like books that were like no longer the library, like how even like today, if no one checked out the books, they would just discard. They were like discarded books. So he had this huge trunk with all these like classic Edgar Allan Poe, all the American classics. So he's like, Americans are so wasteful. Look at all the books. They were hardcover and they throw them away. This is ridiculous. We live in the greatest country. So his term for that is mi quang, which means thrown away American goods. So, but it was our treasure. So he gave us all these books. And so that summer that he came, I started reading, all the American classics. And that's kind of that's how I became interested in literature, because it was great. But it's funny because he mixed up all of these discarded books with his own books that he borrowed from the library. So in the end, he mixed them up. So we don't know which book was his that were like thrown out that he gave us and which books were actually like library books. We just said, okay, just take them, read them. So anyway, so he gave us those books. But the point is that people could reconnect through Vietnamese magazines and newspapers, and that was another aspect of the social life in the early years besides the church. I actually have not been back. I know with my parents, I know that they would not come back. I mean, it's very clear to them. I know that a lot of people have come back. And to me, it's not that I won't come back. I think I probably will come back, but I just don't know the question. I mean, the time has not come up yet. Like, I think the time that we could have come back was like when we first got married, because that was before we had children. And then when we started having children, it was just harder because it's such a long way. And we kept saying, well, if you go, you would have to go for like an extended period of time, so you could really see the country and all that. And so we just never had enough time, or maybe we should have made time for that, but it hadn't come up. But now that the kids are older, so there is more of a possibility. I know it would still be hard, to justify that, to our parents, because to my parents, they left because it was like a rejection of the communist regime. So if you reject that, and if that regime hasn't changed that, why would they come back? Because they see that as basically, my mom used the metaphor of leaving your house, your own home, and you left your home and then someone else took over, and then now you coming back, but you have to beg them. So to her, it doesn't make any sense. My views are not that extreme. And also I have friends who have been, who've gone back. I think each person just has to make that decision for themselves. But I think that the idea of being refugees or being immigrant, and leaving in 75 and with, and the people who are coming over here to study, the boundary, the distinction between refugee and transnationals is much smaller now. It's almost like it's ambiguous, because people who were refugees decided to come back to Vietnam and live there. And because it's not, if they decide that the American society is not the ideal that they were looking for, then they have the choice of going elsewhere. They could go back to Vietnam, or they could live in another country. So to me, you have all of these choices, not so black and white anymore. But I guess I have to make that decision of when I want to come back. I still think that if I were to come back, I may have to make several trips, like to take to go back with my kids would be one trip to introduce them. But to go back for myself, I would have to take a separate trip so that I can have the time to kind of contemplate. When I grew up, like during the war, travel was really restricted. So the only place that I could go back then, before 75, was to the beach, the French word is Cap Saint-Jacques. It was like Vũng Tàu, it's like 3 hours away from Saigon, or Đà Lạt. But Nha Trang, you have to fly. And I think even in the latter years, it was harder to travel because of all the, all the things that were going on. So travel was very restricted. So to go back, it would be meaningful, because now I could travel to places that my grandparents grew up in that I've never seen, because they came from the north. My family, when Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel in 1954, because if you know the history, Ho Chi Minh, basically, after he declared independence, he took over North Vietnam, and then the French came back in, but then they were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, and then the country was divided because the South Vietnamese did not want to follow communist rule. So it became two countries for 20 years, from 1954 to 1975. And so my grandparents, both sets, came from the north. And for years they told me about places that they grew up in, but I've never experienced directly. So to me, it would be really special if I could go back and see, those places for myself. As far as, I think your second question is solidarity, how I feel. I think I mostly feel the solidarity with the writing community because that's what I always wanted to do, is to be a writer. So with other writers and artists, I feel like the most comfortable with, and I found that community when I started becoming an editor for Zamo magazine, which is an online publication that is based in California. But because we are online, we champion dissident writers from Vietnam who had no forum to publish their work inside Vietnam. But we also wanted to support writers who are still writing in Vietnamese. I used to think that if you are a writer and if you live in this country, you have to write in English because otherwise, who are going to read you? But I have changed that. So that is one of the shifts that, 16 years ago, 2007 is when I first came on board to Zamo, this magazine. I was kind of different from the rest of the board, on this magazine because for years I had been writing and publishing in English. So I actually wasn't used to writing in Vietnamese. So by being on board, I had to relearn and I had to start writing in Vietnamese. And so at first they would correct my Vietnamese because I hadn't spoken and written Vietnamese for so long. So every time when I wrote something in Vietnamese, I had to have a dictionary with me. It was like my appendage. And after a while, after like maybe the 3 or 4 years, I was like, hey, I realized I didn't need the dictionary anymore because once you get immersed, then you could, you become. And then when you start writing English again and you start doubting yourself, like, is that right? So you're constantly in this kind of no man's land because, it's kind of confusing. Because it's like when you can only be, well, for me anyway, can only be fully immersive in one context, and you switch and you get kind of, you feel kind of like untethered. But anyway, yes, I do feel like very strongly, I feel this solidarity with the writing community because of, of what we're doing. And I said that I've changed my view. That I think that Vietnamese is something that's we need to preserve and we need to promote that. And also, as a translator, I also want to translate certain Vietnamese words into English. So now, Anglo readers can read it because it's still a very almost esoteric. Almost, it's not as like we don't have a lot of material like Chinese literature and translation or Japanese, any of the more established East Asian languages. So there's not enough of like quality control, from work being translated from Vietnamese to English. So there is more than ever like the need for like people who work in the translation field. So I do feel like there is an urgent need for that, and I've changed my mind, because I think. And I kind of loop back to the beginning too, like how my dad, when he was writing for his peers. So there is a sense when you write in Vietnamese that you can be free. There is, you don't need to explain to anyone. And of course, like, people now, I mean, you've read Viet Thanh Nguyen or any of the, Asian American writers or any writers coming from another perspective, it's like diasporic, perspective, that you don't need to explain yourself to anyone, but you kind of do in a way. You have not gotten away from that yet because you're still working from a minority viewpoint to the mainstream viewpoint. It would be great if one day you can work in an environment where you don't have to explain anything, and that's the freedom that you get in writing in Vietnamese. In expressing yourself in Vietnamese, everybody get your joke, your inside jokes, your references. You don't need to like spend the whole exposition and explain this is that. You don't have to explain everything, but then you lose your audience. And so, what is your role? If your role is advocacy, a lot of advocacy is making the other side feeling the person in front of you feeling comfortable. You wanted to pull them in. So there's explanation involved in that. And there's burden in that too. So that is a burden when you write in English from a minority standpoint. But the burden less so when you write among your peers in Vietnamese. it's funny. I think a lot of people get offended by the question, like, where are you from? But that question, actually, it doesn't bother me so much because it depends on who asked that question. If the person who asked that question, most of the time, like if I'm in New York City, the question that the person most likely asked me that question is like, they're taxi cab drivers, you know, because they're also immigrants, so they're curious. So I don't feel offended if someone asks me that, especially if the other person is also, you know, an immigrant, because they're curious. And even, I'm not quite sure if even if a white person asked me that question that I would necessarily be offended, but the one comment that kind of like annoys me is when they say, you write really well. And I'm like, why? You know, I mean, I have a law degree here. I mean, I write here. Why shouldn't I write well? But I get that a lot. You know, even from fairly educated peers, they say, you write really well. I don't understand that, you know, and maybe I should say something. Up to this point, I haven't said anything, but I probably should say that because they would never make that comment to a person, you know, who looked like that, right? Like, why would they say that? I suppose if there were, it could be more, you know, it's probably not overt. And if it's not overt, it probably went over my head. So, you know, I can't think of anything that is so overt. Although, like a few times in my, you know, in my career as a lawyer, I have heard comments doing job reviews, you know, like performance reviews. My supervisor would say things like, you know, you don't seem assertive enough. You don't, like, when you walk to a room, you don't talk too much. You're quiet. So that's just like, you know, the stereotype. It seems like if they think of you as quiet or unassuming, it's already in their mind. They think that you're not going to make any waves. So already they have that. And I never challenged that. And it's only, you know, from experience, like later on I thought back and I'm like, you know, that should not be an issue if you still can perform your work, whether you are, you know, an extrovert or an introvert. That should not really affect, you know, my performance. So that should have been something that I could have said. But again, all of these things come with experience. You don't have, you know, at the time, you don't have a way to counter that until it starts happening over and over and it becomes a pattern. And then you say, you know, this is not random. But then it's like kind of too late, you know, but maybe I can pass it on to other people and say, don't accept that. If they say that you should be this way or that way, because the one thing that should be, you know, should count is your work. And it kind of goes back to the whole idea enforced intimacy that I find I'm still struggling with, you know, like the idea that you go to a cocktail party and you're supposed to make small talk and you do like these chatter. And, you know, you have to be charming and all that, and they kind of judge you on that too, rather than like, you know, your worth and whatever you say, you're being judged on that. So as a minority person, that is still a burden. And one thing I don't understand is, you know, like when I went to law school, there were only 5 Asian at UVA. Now I think that there's a lot, but in my field though, they still have a lot of I still don't see a lot of Asian faces. And I think that, you know, until you have more people, you see people that are more like you, there's these kind of latent, they're more like microaggressions. They're not going to go away until you see more. So I think it's probably a systemic thing. You need to have more Asian faces. You have to kind of more training, you know, on the supervisory level to be more aware of these things, because it's hard. It's so entrenched. Yeah, I think curiosity. You know, always wanted to learn knowledge. I think knowledge is what's always is the one thing that's driving me. I'm always curious to know how someone else is thinking. And I think it's just like with me, like how I have to have all this information before I can act. I know that I've been accused like that, of being procrastinating or, just like not acting quickly enough. But it's just my mode, my MO. It's like I wanted to have the big picture. I have to have everything in front of me. So I think, and that kind of true with how I go forward in life. Like I'm always curious, driven by knowledge. I wanted to know as much as I can because there's so many things I want to know. I mean, it's just such a, it's just like, there's a lot going on. I don't understand like why people are ever like bored or not knowing like what, like not having enough to do. It's just your own mind, all the things that you could think, it's just a lot. Yeah. The main thing is I still see like a gap between, I happen to be bilingual, so I kind of see both sides, the people in my parents' generations and then the younger people. But there is a gap, there is a discrepancy or a disconnect between Vietnamese-American who can only read and write in English, but they can't not read Vietnamese. So they're not aware of all the things that are kind of, again, we go back to the idea of people writing in Vietnamese are talking among themselves, but not sharing it with the larger world. And then you have Vietnamese Americans growing up here who basically write in English and being trained in kind of American way, but not necessarily tapping into all these resources that the Vietnamese community has. So there's not a kind of a bridging between two worlds. And a lot of time, the Vietnamese American who can only read materials in English would end up depending on sources written by other white scholars who are not that well versed in Vietnamese, or they also kind of repeat what other white people say. So you kind of have these like errors of perception that just get piled on. But because the Vietnamese Americans who cannot tap into the Vietnamese language sources, they keep relying on that because they can't. So you have like conversations going off in tangent and there's no bridging. And so you will always have this miscommunication between the generations when you have this language barrier. And I don't know how to bridge that. Because it's the situations is not ideal for Vietnamese Americans who grow up here to be fluent, because language is something and culture is something that is layers by layers you build. And it's also an option. I guess I chose to keep reading in Vietnamese and be immersive in it. But when you move away from the linguistic or cultural, you do lose that. So I don't feel grounded. I mean, yes, I guess I can switch back and forth. But at the same time, the thing is, I don't feel grounded in either. I always feel kind of untethered. But at least I think I can see both. But because I'm afraid of the disconnect between when you don't have, the interaction between two, and I don't know how you can bridge that gap because of just the way things are. And the lack of resources. So I don't know if it adds anything and whether it can help you to go forward with that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.